I'm Bob Wilson. I'm on the faculty here at the LBJ School. And just a couple of quick points. One, I'm sure everybody in the audience appreciates the work the organizers have done of this event. I think it's absolutely terrific. Bringing together NAFTA after 20 years and the recognition of Sidney Weintraub, reflections on where the state of affairs between the U.S. and Mexico. It's really been a terrific session, and our thanks to the organizers. We heard some wonderful words said about Sidney Weintraub. I'm just going to make one additional comment. Sidney and I overlapped for many years here at the LBJ School, and I always admired him. But the one thing that really sticks out in my time knowing Sid, sometime probably in the late 1980s, there's an enormous amount of controversy here in the state of Texas about the impact of illegal immigration, undocumented workers on government in Texas, and in particular on services provided by government in localities. A lot of controversy about this. Sid organized a project to look explicitly at that question. To what extent are undocumented residents, workers, using local services? Very controversial area, but he did it, as it was described today, very analytically, gathering evidence. I'm not sure that the evidence prevailed in the policy discussions about it, but it struck me as absolutely the right thing to do. So we very much appreciate Sid's time here at the LBJ School. Moving on to the panel, we're going to talk about transportation, infrastructure, and environment on this panel. We've talked several times, people have talked about the question of integration in the first instance, the integration of trade between the two countries. Here we're going to kind of expand on what we mean by integration. We're going to look at different kinds of infrastructure systems, common resources that we find, and we'll go into a little bit of more detail in some of these areas. One thing, the barrier, and I think now that we have a wall between the two countries, it becomes even clearer. In some ways, there is easy exchange between the two countries. In other areas, it's extraordinarily difficult exchange, complicated by the fact that we have different levels of development on each side of the border. And for some of these infrastructure systems and common resources, this really is a key point of possibly of tension, but also something we in the policy world need to focus on to try to overcome. So we're going to be talking about infrastructure, and we have four panelists. I'm going to change the order just a little bit. We're going to start with Leigh Boske, my colleague here at the LBJ School, a longtime colleague at the LBJ School, and he's going to be speaking of transportation. So Leigh, let me turn it over to you.
I am going to keep it short. I'm told that Chandler Stope mentioned to some people that in the 80s, I believe it was, Sidney Weintraub, Chandler, and I did a few policy research projects. This was before NAFTA, et cetera, and they really introduced me to Mexico. First time I went to Mexico City with Sidney Weintraub, it was a stark revelation of just how he knew everybody in government, how everybody knew him. Chandler was more interesting. He took me to places that no visitor would go. He booked us at a hotel that was run down and was known for a dead poet committing suicide there. So I got to see quite a different aspects of it. After that, I ran into, by accident, a woman named Nancy McRae at the international office within the Office of the Secretary, U.S. Department of Transportation. And within a couple of years, she was appointed the chief negotiator on transportation provisions. And I had taken a leave to go to the Texas Department of Transportation to help them out with their state transportation plan, and so she brought me on board. It was really interesting going through the different provisions within NAFTA. I just got it out to prepare for this. Whether you know it or not, there's 22 chapters. There's about 40 annexes to it. No chapter devoted to transportation. It's spread out among the different chapters depending upon what it is. As it turns out, that experience has, with NAFTA itself, with the agreement, has very little to do with the success of Mexico. Because the United States decided to unilaterally put an embargo over Mexican trucks coming here. Even though there's dispute resolution provisions within the agreement, Bill Clinton decided that the Teamsters were more important than the truckers were. So what I want to talk about when it comes to how transportation contributes to the success of NAFTA has nothing to do with the agreement itself. My remarks are going to go very quickly. In 1989, about 10 years after the United States decided to deregulate its transportation industry, Mexico embarked upon it. And in ensuing years, it not only had the different modes, the different means of transportation, rail, maritime, trucks being deregulated, but privatization as well. Privatization was an instant success. Anybody who knows what happened to the Mexican toll roads back then knows that Mexico had its fit and starts. But it learned from its experiences, and when it decided to privatize its airport terminals and its seaport terminals, and going beyond just simple reforms in the Mexican National Railways, it had much more success. What this led to, even before NAFTA, was just a spurt of activity, creative activity in Mexico when it was dealing with joint ventures, because it liberalized the regulation, liberalized joint ventures, when it had to do with partnerships, et cetera. And when NAFTA passed, that extended to U.S. firms. U.S. firms decided that although there's an embargo, that it could partner with a Mexican trucking firm. J.B. Hunt, which is one of the very big truckers in the United States, partnered with TMM, the multimodal transportation company in Mexico. And that was really the start. Then came the national infrastructure plans. And I revisit Mexico and what's happening in NAFTA every 6 years because that coincides with the national infrastructure plans. And that's when a lot of money started pouring into things like telecommunications, which I'm sure you're going to mention, and transportation sector as well. And transportation really, when it came to infrastructure, grew. But that's the least important one I wanted to point out. About 10 years ago, I did a study on the difference between a transportation corridor and a trade corridor. If all you had needed was a transportation corridor for trade, and the Trans-Alaska highway should be booming these days. But you need more than that. And what you need is a whole support system, which is called supply chain logistics in it. And supply chain logistics really does help one out with the paperwork. It has free trade zones in it. Sometimes it has one-stop shopping because all the ingredients that you need, they're called inland logistics hubs, et cetera. And Mexico, very early in the game, decided to really not only invest in such things and plan with such things, but create different bodies to coordinate with a network of logistics hubs in Mexico, which in effect translated those transportation corridors into trade corridors. Couldn't have been possible without them. And just out of my cheat sheets, I wanted to point out that in 2004, with the National Development Plan came a multimodal corridors development coordination agreement between the private sector and the public sector. And the whole purpose of it was to promote development of multimodal corridors. Then there was, and they created even a committee to have procedure manuals of helping businesses negotiate that. Within the northern Mexico, there was an organization called Invite, which was a regional integration program which developed regional agreements on how to have businesses to cooperate with each other. There's a Mexican Association of Industrial Parks now, which incorporates this. And what really caught my attention when I was looking at the 2007 to 2012 National Infrastructure Plan was coming across and interviewing the industrial parks in Mexico, that there are now memorandum of understanding between industrial parks such as the Dallas logistics hubs and logistics hubs in Mexico to try to coordinate their activities. Now all of a sudden you can really talk about trade corridors, and you can talk about how you can use creativity to get around it. When NAFTA stopped the trucks, stopped the trucks, there was a firm called Landstar. Landstar basically continued the air transport, the land portion of air transport. And when it couldn't clear customs on the border, it had an airway bill. So it claimed that because it was an airway bill, it could go across the border without stopping at all and clear customs at Benito Juarez International Airport, which it did. And when the difference between being a transportation economist and being a supply chain economist is you're always thinking of creative ways to be able to deliver projects, where it's through joint ventures, et cetera. I am very impressed with what's happening in Mexico, even more impressed than what's happening along the border. Too much, we just concentrate on custom delays, and we say if we facilitate customs, the customs transit, then all of a sudden most of our problems will go away. To be sure, there along the border, there's some good things happening in the customs clearance. Going to my cheat sheets, I think in the Diario Oficial for December 13th, 2013, the Mexican government has it as an intent to really reform in a meaningful way the Mexican side of customs clearance. This involves electronic data submission, and it involves doing away, almost eliminating with the current role that Mexican customs brokers have with the Mexican customs officials on it. It involves trying to institute some fast lanes that we have adopted in our own country, trying to deal with security and model them after some of the security programs in the United States. So that's good as well. But the trouble with the border is one point, and if NAFTA is ever going to be meaningfully integrated, I guess my final point on this is that what you need is a network. You need a network of integrated supply logistics where firms can look at an entire system and be able to respond to whatever needs an industry has in whatever location for it. And I think Mexico is quickly coming to that. I'm running a policy research project course at the LBJ school right now, similar to what we did with Sidney Weintraub in the late 80s. And I'm trying to send students with to some of the logistics parks in Mexico and in the I-35 corridor, just to try to see to what extent this cooperation is extending beyond governments. This is just businesses on both sides of the border trying to take their destinies in their own hands. They may not be able to cure the problems with the border. That involves government officials who can't be avoided. But it's certainly, when it comes to trade corridors, it's something that I think is meaningful. So when you're talking about integrated economies, North American economies, a precondition of that has to be its distribution system. And that's what we're looking into now. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you, Leigh. And you demonstrated very effectively the point I was making, and that is talking about integration, you need to look at individual systems and how things on the ground are relating or not relating to each other. So appreciate the update on transportation planning. Next, we'll hear from David Eaton, a professor also at the LBJ School, that will be talking about the environment. A professor with long experience looking at common resources in South Texas.
Thanks very much, Bob. I want to, let's see, is this on? It is, okay. Since this,
Closer.
Okay. Since this meeting is in honor of Sydney, I want to make clear that I would never have gotten involved with border issues and with the NAFTA had Sydney not encouraged me to do it and mentored me through it. And it's been a real contribution. It's been a major part of my career, and I'm very grateful and will be for my lifetime for the guidance and advice that Sydney provided. With respect to environment, along with the NAFTA agreement, there were two environmental side agreements. One side agreement that became operational on December 1, 1993, created the North American Commission on Environmental Cooperation. The Second Amendment in November 1993 created the Border Environmental Cooperation Commission and the North American Development Bank. So I'm going to be talking about the implementation of those two side agreements. And because it's the 20th anniversary, it's actually in the 21st year since both of those began in 1993, I'm going to talk about 21 successes of those two amendments with respect to integrating the border environment. So unlike some of my economics colleagues who see on the one hand, on the other hand, I see tremendous success, but at the end I'll say we still have a long way to go. What are some of the contributions? First, I'll talk about the North American Commission on Environmental Cooperation. This is the unit out of Montreal that allows the parties to look, allows Canada, Mexico, and the United States to look at the environmental issues across all the boundaries in North America. And there's 7 different contributions, 7 great successes of the CEC. First, its structure at the time was unique. This is a trilateral organization with staff from 3 countries that work together as one staff and with rotating leadership. This has been a successful system. It has functioned well, and it's been an example for other organizations around the world. And if anybody wants to ask, I can talk about some of those applications. Through the Commission on Environmental Cooperation, Mexico, Canada, and the United States were able to demonstrate that they could discuss common environmental issues across North America. There have been over 400 background papers that have been prepared, reports, conference proceedings on a wide variety of environmental challenges, such as burning of waste, transportation of hazardous materials, protecting endangered species and at-risk ecosystems, a wide variety of things. The Commission on Environmental Cooperation, the third element, is achieved some real successes in improving the environment. For example, in 1999, the 3 parties said we really should do something about the use of the pesticide lindane. And so they began a process to try and reduce it. And as of today, the United States has ended all, and the reason why they wanted to do that is lindane is a neurotoxin that can affect human health. As of today, there are no authorized uses of lindane in the United States. Canadian uses will cease in 2016, and in Mexico, they're canceling the last 3 uses, and around the world, lindane is being eliminated as a pesticide because it's really not as effective as alternatives, and you have that health effects. This was the Commission on Environmental Cooperation led that effort. Fourth, Article 14 of the Commission on Environmental Cooperation allows citizens and environmental groups from Mexico to Canada and the United States to challenge their respective governments for failure to enforce their own environmental rules. And this has been very successful provision. There have been 83 Article 14 challenges, and in many cases, the challenges have encouraged, I won't say forced because it's tough to force a sovereign government, but have encouraged strongly and led to environmental changes in each of the countries. A fifth element is under NAFTA, there's Chapter 11, in which a company can dispute the enforcement of environmental rules with one of the NAFTA parties and can bring the dispute to arbitration. Since 2004, these so-called Article 11 arbitrations have been operating openly and are available for the public to observe, and indeed nonprofit organizations can file Friends of the Court briefs, and these arbitrations have worked to resolve disputes between companies and governments rapidly and with some environmental consequences. The Commission on Environmental Cooperation, their small grant program, has been very successful in facilitating nonprofit organizations in all 3 countries to look at issues that no one else would look at for very small amounts of money, and these have been very thoughtful and powerful studies that have led to some other things. The annual reports that the Commission on Environmental Cooperation produces each year give a perspective of what's going on in the environment in North America, and they often have themes that are very useful and helpful. And the final impact of the CEC moved forward for the public posting of data in a variety of ways, but the key one has been the North American Pollution Release and Transfer Database. Each country voluntarily posts information they have on toxic releases to all media, and this is publicly available. This has led to significant reduction of toxic releases in all of the 3 countries because people are embarrassed by it. Okay, Beck and NADBank. I'm not going to be able to go through all 21. I'll get through as many as I can, Bob, but I'm speaking as fast. Okay. So Beck and NADBank, through their structure as a bilateral, as 2 institutions with 1 board, with staff who are from both countries, have themselves been a remarkable, successful operation of an institution, and also serves as an example for countries in the rest of the world. Beck has been able to succeed in working with communities in both Mexico and the United States to identify border projects for infrastructure investment. As of June 30th, 2013, Beck had invested $43 million in helping 164 communities develop project ideas. They wouldn't have come without that investment, including 72 projects and 92 in Mexico, 92 in the United States. Beck has succeeded in certifying the technical feasibility of infrastructure projects in a reasonable time frame, and usually with public support. As of June 30th, 2013, Beck had certified 219 projects as acceptable where they were ready for consideration for funding, 102 in the United States, 117 in Mexico, and there's a distribution, but I don't have time to go through it. NADBank, Beck does the authorization, basically says that the infrastructure is reasonably well planned. NADBank is responsible for funding. NADBank, as an infrastructure bank jointly owned by the U.S. and Mexico, has been able to leverage its $3 billion in startup capital with grants and loans, and it's actually been quite successful. With all the difficulties it has, it's been very successful. As of June 30th, 2013, the total approved NADBank financing for 94 Mexican projects and 86 U.S. projects came to $5.4 billion. Of that sum, $2.1 billion has been contracted and $1.8 billion has been dispersed. Public water supplies have been significantly improved along the U.S.-Mexico border. Wherever there's been investment, public water supplies have been improved. Wastewater treatment, same thing. Wherever there has been investment, and you can see in the census information for Mexico and the United States, improvement in the wastewater treatment circumstance. Ambient water quality. Wherever there's been investment, ambient water quality has been improved, and I'll talk at the end, if I have 30 seconds, about some of the remaining problems. Beck and NADBank has created, through the NAFTA process, there's been a series of cooperative programs involving federal, state, and local governments. First it was Border 2000, then Border 2012, then Border 2020. This is an example of federal, state, local cooperation on in effect a small regional basis. This also is an example that other countries around the world have thought to use. Border 2020 has resulted in revisions of, we have sister city cooperation between border twin cities, and they've been able to develop through a couple of rounds joint contingency plans to respond with greater speed and reliability in the event of a hazardous waste or other environmental emergency such as an earthquake. Beck and NADBank have trained thousands of environmental professionals, a key element enabling people both to plan and manage environmental infrastructure. That's been a great success. The border programs have been able to reduce waste tire piles along the borders. There's even one that had 4 million tires, and there's no tires left. So it's a great success, although we could talk about the limits. The border programs have been successful in facilitating major sister city hazardous waste cleanup exercises. Both sides have been very successful in collecting waste, recycling waste, reusing it, and definitely collecting hazardous materials. But the most important, and I'm actually getting through it, Bob, thank you. The most important contribution that the NAFTA process has made for the environment is the leverage of the NAFTA process is not just improving the environment along the U.S.-Mexico border, but throughout Mexico. Because I had a conversation with a senior water official in Mexico. He said, I want the United States to push on improving water quality along the border. And I said, why? He said, because when we are successful there, it shows what we can do in the rest of the country, and this gives us leverage to improve the environment in the rest of the country. So NAFTA has been tremendously successful in motivating improvement of the environment through all of Mexico. Now, if I step back and say, is this working fully? Absolutely. If you look at the improvement of the environment, the answer would be, look, there are lots of environmental problems. There's still a tremendous need for investment in water, wastewater, air pollution, solid waste, all of these things. But this is not a fault of NAFTA. This is a challenge in any utility. A utility, like a living being, has to grow and respond to growth and development of technology. And so it's not a fault of NAFTA, it's a reality of any kind of economic development. And the challenge that we face now, looking at the next 20 years, really is, this is not a financing issue. This is not an infrastructure issue. This is an issue of political will. Around the NAFTA passage of NAFTA, there was a political will to invest and improve the environment and make those investments. This is something we have to do, or we'll fall behind. Thank you, Bob.
Oh, very good. Thank you, Dave. You covered a lot very quickly. Appreciate you sticking with the time. Next, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Judith Mariscal. She was introduced yesterday, one of the first PhD graduates of the LBJ School, an expert in telecommunications, and now works in CEDA in Mexico City. So Judith will be talking about telecommunications.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be back in Austin. Thank you, Vicky, Jamie, and Peter for inviting me. My basic argument here is that trade policy, liberalization policies, rarely move out in front of domestic policies, regulatory policies. However, what we are seeing in the case of telecommunications, as in other policy areas, is an increasing integration between our two countries, economic in general in society, despite not full trade agreements. What happened in NAFTA, just a little bit of history looking back. NAFTA, telecom didn't really make it into NAFTA. The basic segment of telecommunications was not included in the agreement. What was included back then was value-added services and telecommunications equipment. Why not? It's kind of ironic because the three countries were pursuing somewhat at the same time liberalizing policies, opening up their markets to competition and to more entrance into the market. However, the nature of each reform was different. In Mexico, what was going actually, before NAFTA was signed, the telephone company in Mexico was already privatized. We had Telmex as a private monopoly, actually, because until 1996, it was stipulated to be open to other markets. But what you have basically behind the reform in Mexico is the idea of a national champion, thinking that the US companies are going to come into Mexico and compete and destroy the small Mexican company. So there's this going on. In the US, you had, following the AT&T divestiture, back in the 80s, in 1996, you had a promotion of competition in the market as well. What you have here that is preventing basic telephony to go into NAFTA is the fact that the ITT divestiture did not allow Southwestern Bell companies to go into long-distance market. It turns out that Southwestern Bell was the main shareholder in Telmex. So if you would have opened it, it was a backdoor into a US regulation. And in Canada, you had strong foreign direct investment restrictions. So I think that's one look at why basic telephony did not go into NAFTA. However, it did, telecommunications equipment was very beneficial, especially in Mexico. What you see today is, again, this integration not only of imports but of exports. In the US, if you look at the single most important markets, Mexico and then Canada are the single most important markets for the exports of telecommunications equipment. Going faster. Of course, the composition of this trade is different. From Mexico, what you have is that they're mostly maquila-based. However, what we see, for example, is that these industrial parks, this is data from 2000 that is comparable with all the industrial parks in Mexico, but they're increasing day by day. Mexico has become a manufacturing hub for telecommunications equipment to the rest of the world, including the US. For example, for Cisco, the US company, Mexico is the most important manufacturing hub. This year, they say they will invest 1.3 billion US dollars. IBM is doing cloud computing services, as is Intel. What is interesting then is that in basic telephony then, you don't have, you have strong, very strict FDA requirements, restrictions in the three countries, especially in Canada and Mexico. However, through a sort of financial scheme, Southwestern Bell bought the majority of shares of Grupo Carso back then in 1990, while the controlling shares were in the hands of Mexicans, of Grupo Carso, Carlos Slim. Back then, Southwestern Bell owned the majority of the company. So US capital did come to Mexico, despite the fact that it was not included in the agreement. AT&T and MCI also came later. We have Nextel coming in, investing quite a bit. Southwestern Bell invested around $13 billion. Nextel today is having problems for other reasons, mostly the technology they chose. What you see, though, that this was very short-lived. They came in 1996, the market was open, they gained a lot of market share, and then they left. Now, today, what we have in the mobile telephony market, which was born without foreign direct investment restrictions, is a very concentrated market. That is explained by a regulatory system, which we could talk a lot about that, but I think one of the biggest flaws here that could explain this is institutional inadequacy, weakness, and rule of law, going back to this idea we were talking about yesterday. This has changed. But then what you see also is that, ironically, what was expected during the early 1990s all over the world, where telephone companies were privatized and liberalized, is the objective. They thought, well, this is going to be an atomized market with a lot of players. This did not happen in most of the world, especially in Latin America. What we still see today is a duopoly. The US-based markets left the region, left Latin America in general. And what we have is Telefónica from Spain and América Móvil that were fully supported by their government. However, this other thing is going on, which is migration. Even though today we're seeing these numbers coming down, the population of Mexican origins or Mexicans or Hispanics is very, very high. And this is really the basic, I think, explaining variable of integration in telecommunications. North America is the most integrated region in the world. So even though basic telephony did not go into the agreement, what we see is that voice, people calling from the US to Mexico, is one of the highest in the world. They are the top international routes, significantly higher than others. And also, well, in Mexico, it's no surprise, it's 86% of calls are to the US. Other areas of integration, of course, are the international bandwidth, the hub, the interconnection is basically in the US. And you can see now with technological innovation that this integration is still stronger, coming in stronger. Other ways of integration have been América Móvil, the largest company in Mexico and in some Latin American countries, provides service through cable submarines that are connected via the US. So, in summary, what do we see here? Any trade policy entails some loss of independence. In the case of regulatory policy, this is especially complex because, as we saw, for example, in the GATS agreements, that we got a higher level of liberalization, not quite an open telecom market, but it requires a harmonization of the regulatory systems between the countries involved. And that becomes very, very complicated. We did see, however, in NAFTA, and if the question directly is, did NAFTA benefit the telecommunications sector? Did it benefit the telecommunications consumer in Mexico, at least? Yes, it did. It clearly did. It created a lot of jobs in manufacturing and equipment. It also brought in competition that increased penetration, that increased quality, and that diminished prices. There were restrictions in investment, in foreign investment, but I think more significant than that was the restrictions in the lack of regulatory harmonization between the countries. Today, I think we have a different scenario. Last year, the Congress passed a sweeping telecommunications reform, constitutional amendments, the reform in Mexico. Today, there is no foreign direct investment restriction in any of the telephony markets. There is, though, in broadcasting, which gives you just an idea of the power of lobbying by TV companies in Mexico. However, and I would leave this here, is that do we need a further, NAFTA expansion? I think that what we're going to see more and more is that not only migration, and migration is here, and people are talking to each other from Mexico to the US, is that technological innovation, internet use, cloud computing, all this is just making the trade agreement less of a necessity and more of a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. That's a terrific presentation, and Judith has become quite prominent in Mexico talking about telecommunications, and I think from this presentation it's clear why that's the case. Our third panelist, very pleased to introduce Geronimo Gutierrez, who's had a lot of experience in U.S.-Mexico relations from the Foreign Service in Mexico and other positions. He comes to us now as the Executive Director of the North American Development Bank that we just was introduced, and one of the institutions created by NAFTA. Geronimo is going to talk more generally about infrastructure and relations between the U.S. and Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me also thank the organizers of the event, Peter, Victoria, for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon and last night. I think this is really a timely seminar for many reasons, the 20th anniversary, and also the presidents are meeting just maybe 10 days from now. So it's always useful to reflect upon what has happened and what could happen. I want to recognize here the presence of my friend and former colleague, the Ambassador Rosalba Ojeda, who's General Counsel of Mexico here in Austin, and also a great person, but I truly say someone who has been very active also professionally in U.S.-Mexico relations. I have to make a disclaimer in the form of an apology. It's been a long time since I wrote anything academic, and also a long time since I taught any course. So my remarks are going to be more from the practitioner's perspective. And being in a table with all professors, I feel somewhat intimidated, but I'll try to do my best. Yesterday it was very clear, well, at least to me, that NAFTA, I think President Cedillo's conclusion was right on mark. NAFTA is excellent, but not sufficient. He argued, rightly, from my point of view, that on the Mexican side there are still a lot of reform spending, strictly a responsibility of Mexico to really take advantage of NAFTA. And in many ways, that has been stressed over the course of today's comments and yesterday's presentation. I think the intended objectives of NAFTA were completely fulfilled, which was increase trade and investment flows and establish a set of rules to govern those flows. And in my view, from any perspective, NAFTA has been extremely successful as measured by those very specific intended objectives and consequences. And as Professor Galbraith mentioned today, it's very difficult to really think about what would have happened if NAFTA was not there. Certainly, there is not an easy academically rigorous way to evaluate that. So always when thinking about the consequences of NAFTA, it's slippery slope terrain, especially for professors. I think that what has happened is that NAFTA, as it was also mentioned yesterday, NAFTA, the competitiveness advantage given to the three countries simply by trade liberalization, by tariff reduction, gradually has been eroded. So we need to think as a region, and this is on the area of what comes next, or this is not sufficient, what to do next. Because those advantages are no longer there for Mexico, Canada, or the United States. So the great growth that we actually saw on the three countries from, and I will start from 1996 up to at least the year 2000, largely, in my view, dependent upon free trade with NAFTA, is no longer there because there are other players in the market and there's trade liberalization that has eroded. So the second stage of NAFTA, in my view, has to do, NAFTA was about free trade. NAFTA in the future is about share production. And if NAFTA in the future is about share production, then we need to think about infrastructure, because infrastructure is a key element that I think will help precisely move from simply free trade to share production. So let me talk briefly about 5 areas in infrastructure that I think are important. One is points of entry. Everybody that knows the border and goes to the border complains about the waiting times. There are a lot of studies that show how much Mexico and the US in particular, but also the three countries, are losing because we're not able to establish a rapid flow of goods across the border. Precisely related to just-in-time inventories and supply chains. If you're not able to move your projects quickly, your products today, you're not going to be competitive. And we have simply although there have been important advances over the past 2 decades, it takes 15 years on average to build a new border crossing between Mexico and the United States. So that is an area that needs to be addressed. There are a lot of challenges. It's complex because it's an intergovernmental coordination. A lot of it is needed, not only within the United States, within Mexico, but also among both countries. Mexico and the US have the busiest border in the world. Every day, 20,000 containers, you can correct me, cross the border, Professor. And if you simply don't have the point of entry infrastructure that is needed, we're not going to be competitive as a region in the context of share production. I think that's an important area. The second one is energy. There's been a lot of changes in energy in the United States. Certainly the possibility of having a self-sufficient United States from an energy perspective is a complete game changer in the world, in the energy markets. Mexico has also undertaken a very profound reform of its energy sector. So there is a change, a much of a change environment in energy. So what can be done? I think that rightly so, there are increased comments or proposals to let's think about a joint energy or a North American strategy or North American energy security. And Alejandro will comment, I'm sure, more about this, so I won't take a lot of time, but there are very specific opportunities, some of them which are now beginning. Electricity interconnections, that Mexico and the US exchanged electricity since 1908, if I'm not mistaken, but there is a huge potential to improve that exchange of energy, and there is a need for infrastructure that lines that would help achieve greater interconnection in electricity. Natural gas, there's no secret that Mexico, just to give you an example, it's importing some of its gas at $18 BTU, where Texas gas is around 4.5, 3.5. Someone can correct me, but it's a huge difference. So it's infrastructure that will connect, that will help move natural gas right now, mainly from Texas to northern and central Mexico. The reform in Mexico will certainly increase the production of natural gas, and certainly that's the strategy. But nevertheless, that'll take a long time, and Mexico imports now around 40% of its natural gas needs, and just a small fraction of it from the United States. So there's a series of projects ongoing and planned that will actually connect on gas. The third one is renewable energy. It happens to be that the border has very good conditions for both wind and solar projects, production of that type of energy. I have to make the commercial. The bank is very much involved in there. We have been able to finance the first wind projects in the Mexico side of the border. We've done in the past 2 years, around 1 gigawatt of renewable energy in the US-Mexico border has been financed by the bank. And there are huge opportunities for investment and for the market. Hopefully next year we will begin construction, actually this year, we will begin construction of the first renewable energy project in Mexico, located in Baja California, that will export renewable energy to the United States. There are opportunities on that because all Mexico and the United States, and particularly the southern states of the United States, have renewable energy parameters or goals that must be achieved, and vice versa. So the possibility of developing renewable energy along the border and elsewhere, it's certainly there. The third one is water, and I often say that water, in 15 years from now, governments are usually behind reality in US-Mexico relation. We're catching up with reality, and reality is usually far ahead from where governments are. 15 years from now, or maybe a little bit less, a little bit more, the number one issue is not going to be security at the border, it's not going to be immigration, it's going to be water. And the bank is a piece of the puzzle in trying to help address this issue. It has been since its inception. We have been able, as it was rightly said, and another commercial, the bank and the BEC have helped improve water treatment on the Mexican side of the border from levels of 20 to 25% in 1994 to around 82% right now. So most of the binational metropolitan areas that did not have, when NAFTA was created, any water treatment on the Mexican side, and water was just being dumped into our shared river basins, that's not longer the case. Again, it's not only because of us, I wish that was the case, but we have certainly helped. And the cooperation, the possibilities of cooperation, joint investment, planning, and everything in our shared water basins, and especially on water conservation projects. it's going to be each day more and more important. It is a challenge to make water projects bankable. It's not easy. Usually they require a significant amount of soft money, and that is not always available. But nevertheless, the challenge is there. And again, the idea of building water infrastructure. And finally, Professor Boske has already talked a bit about logistics, but I think agreeing completely, there are, like, if I'm not mistaken, 3-4 trade or transportation corridors that basically go from Mexico City all the way to Winnipeg, and I-35 is one of them. And I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of talk about these trade corridors. What exactly do we mean by trade corridors? But 3 things are on the making or have been thought about. One is making sure that highways along the 3 countries through those corridors have a minimum standard of properties, qualifications. So everybody that takes that transportation, especially from a highway perspective, knows. Secondly, the coordination among logistics centers, which is extremely important. And thirdly is the idea of having, and this is not so much related to infrastructure, but having transportation pre-cleared. So you put a lock, and nowadays technology allows to have a truck leave from Guanajuato with an electronic lock on place and a pre-specified route from there to Canada that would allow, in principle, that truck not to stop even at the border and just go through, and only stop at the border by officials if it has deviated from its route or if the electronic lock has been broken. That will make us hugely competitive, again, as a region, not as a country. This is about shared production, no longer about trade. 40 cents of everything that every dollar that Mexico exports into the United States has 40 cents of U.S. component in it. So it's really about shared production, intra-industry trade nowadays, and that will continue to increase. So we must have the infrastructure. To conclude, there have been talk also in thinking about what could come next. And this is not certainly not my idea. It has been advocated by many people about creating a North American infrastructure fund as a natural next step for NAFTA. I think the idea deserves a lot of merit. I think that it's not clear exactly how that can be achieved. It would make sense if you set yourself on this notion of shared production and regional competitiveness to figure out what are the 20, 30 great infrastructure projects that the region would need to be more competitive. Some of them in Mexico, some of them transboundary, some of them in Canada, some maybe a port, an airport. I'll give you an example. Tijuana, for the first time, we'll have a binational airport. I think this year will finally be achieved. And the Tijuana airport will have a terminal that just crosses the border into the United States. So people that, because the San Diego airport is saturated, will be able to travel from Tijuana to Osaka to Shanghai or to other Asian destinations, not from San Diego or LA, but actually from Tijuana crossing. You will park your car in San Diego, you will cross over to Tijuana. That is really a regional, that's the type of infrastructure that we're going to need. I think it's important that the governments define what is a regional infrastructure project. Is it transboundary, or is it an infrastructure project that can be located in any one of the 3 countries but could have an impact on the flow of falls? And I think it's not clear whether it will be largely a private or public or joint private-public effort to eventually achieve that fund. I think much research is needed there from the practical point of view and from the academic point of view, but infrastructure is going to be, I think, again, in a shared production context, is one of the things that we need and should be the second phase of NAFTA. Thank you.
Geronimo, a terrific talk, getting us to think about the future and unrealized opportunities that collaboration across these countries, across our countries, hold. There are 4 points that I've seen in these series of excellent presentations. One, the question of scale. One of the promises of free trade is to be able to scale markets in such a way that new economic activity is permitted. But we see here also issues of scale in terms of infrastructure provision and ways of doing things more efficiently if we can reach certain scale economies. We also see innovation very prominent. I think Judith's observation that migrants, Mexicans living in the United States, are a big source of the telecommunications flows back into Mexico, kind of an obvious observation, but also shows really a prevailing role of telecommunications in a whole variety of areas and opportunities for innovation. It sounds like an area that we're not quite as advanced is in regulatory harmonization, particularly in telecommunications. That's not happened yet. Although Dave Eaton gives us some hope that, at least in the environmental area, that maybe progress can be made if you set up the right institutional venues for discussing that. And then finally we have, I don't know whether we should call these common problems or shared resources. And of course these two things are related. Some of the renewable opportunities that we see in Mexico and also here in Texas and elsewhere in the US, opportunities there. Some of our literally shared resources, our water resources, will hopefully force greater collaboration. So some initial thoughts, and what I'd like to do is open it up to the audience, and we'll take 3 or 4 questions from the audience, and then we'll ask our panelists to respond.
Thank you very much. This is a very thought-provoking session. And one reflection is one thing that I remember having discussed with, in another meeting in Kansas City with Christopher Sands. And it is how to piece out some of the trinational federal levels of decision-making as opposed to some of the problems that we face in these challenges that are regional, subnational. So how to make the subnational cooperation be coexisting as a solution to, say, infrastructure problems along with the federal security issues. And I think this is something that we will need to spell out. We know that we have the high-level trilateral commission talking about federal issues, but many of these aspects are local or sub-regional. What do you think about to have the 2 levels of decision-making coincide for benefit?
Thank you. Another question?
Yeah, thank you. I just am impressed by everything I've heard from the panel. And I have a couple of questions. The first is, it was earlier this morning, I don't know if it was one of the 2 professors from Mexico City. They showed a chart that showed that municipal funding was very low. And I know that's been an issue for bonds in Mexico, Geronimo, and for financing of infrastructure projects. I don't know if that's ever going to change or not, but I know that's an issue. That's a problem. And I know that something people have pointed out is that back in 2003, the Beck-NADBank charter was changed so that investment could be made 300 kilometers south, but it's still only 100 kilometers north of the border. And so I've heard arguments that in order to help with some of the regions north of the 100-kilometer area, it should be extended to 300 kilometers. It would help get like Colonias and Nueces County and other areas. And I just want to see what people think, because this was done for the border, but here the definition of the border is changing. So I just don't know what you look to see also for the future of funding for environmental investment along the border.
There's a question here, Peter, please.
Yesterday I was impressed by Doug's statement in his testimony in front of the Senate committee, in which an individual, we thought, a senator who would be a friend of greater cooperation between Mexico and the United States, actually came up on the opposite side. I mean, one of the elephants in the room for people who oppose collaboration with Mexico, and relates very much to infrastructure and bridges and corridors, is the narcotics traffic. Now, how would a plan that's being developed confront that issue in order to quiet some of the knee-jerk reactions against cooperation of this sort?
Thank you. The United States is living the shale gas revolution, and Mexico has just pursued a big energy reform that in the midterm will allow our country to produce gas from a formation, particularly that we share with the United States. So that's a clear case of resources sharing between both countries. So I would like to know just some of your thoughts, particularly from Geronimo and Professor Eaton, on the infrastructure and the environmental challenges that will face Mexico with this new opportunity.
Okay, why don't we get some responses from our panel? Who wants to start? Dave, do you want to, the intergovernmental relations? Okay.
First, a comment about standardizing or harmonizing standards. I guess I'm a fierce opponent of attempting to standardize or harmonize standards, because that is a fool's errand when you have sovereigns that do not wish to standardize their own rules. In fact, one can have progress if you adopt procedures that everybody accepts, but they may or may not reach the particular standards of the governments involved. So if you try to force sovereigns to get the same standards, it won't work very well. I think the point raised about the municipal funding, I mean, the challenges of capital formation, the point is well taken. We really need a capital bank, and certainly the three governments can do what they did in 1994 to, in effect, work together to try and set up some arrangements that could fund some things. But one of the elements that continues to be missing is the capacity of local governments to be able to go on bond markets and to be able to do some things themselves. And one of the challenges for Mexico, if that were ever to be a reform, to be able to enable local states to be able to go on the bond market so they could have independent funding. But certainly, it's going to take somebody with great vision, or some politicians with great vision, to go towards an infrastructure arrangement for North America. But you're absolutely right, Geronimo, that's really what we need, and that is the future, and we've got to be able to have the capacity to produce together.
Why don't we just go down the table? You wanna,
Yeah, it's really on another subject, sort of related, but I think that to me this highlights how, when we think of was NAFTA beneficial or not, if we just leave it at that, one of the lessons of 20 years plus is that, or well, even we knew this before, is that trade policy is not a magic bullet. Free markets are not magic bullets. They may help diminish distortions to the markets in general, not protecting inefficient Mexican companies, for example, but that they need to be coordinated, integrated with other policies. So this idea of funding between the three countries, or U.S. and Mexico, is so important, but so is a labor policy. And when we look at other areas in the world where you have free trade agreements, when they go together with labor policy, or I don't know if this is a bad word nowadays, industrial policy, because you do have, there is a reassignment, a reallocation of resources, and there's losers and there's winners. And so there needs to be policies that support this transition. So in terms of income inequality or in terms of jobs displacements, there is a policy that addresses those temporary distortions and that transition. So sort of my final words here would be trade policy is not the magic bullet. We need integrated policies to increase development.
I have some responses about 3 of the comments. The first one is your comment, can there be such an infrastructure fund for among the 3 countries? It already exists in Europe. Although France, Germany, various countries have their own funding, there for about 15 years now, the European Union has had what they've called the Trans-European Transportation, Telecommunications, and Energy Networks. And they have a fund whose sole purpose is to integrate the economies of the European Union. So if you haven't got a better place to look at the beginning, you might want to see what the history and the challenges are of the Europe. You may know that already, in fact. Number 2, when it comes to the impact of shale and energy exploration in Mexico, to be sure, Pemex its standing policies have been changed, but also, believe it or not, Mexico is currently benefiting in a big way from shale gas discoveries in Texas. Right now, there are 6 natural gas pipelines that used to carry natural gas from Mexico to Texas, and they've reversed their directions. New Star, for example, which is a pipeline company in San Antonio, is investing in, I think, 6 new pipelines to carry across the border. The implications at this point are welcomed by Mexico because there's this term called reshoring where you have, among other things, Chinese companies coming back to Mexico that left in the first place, and that was due to such factors as proximity to markets, reduction in transportation cost, if you can avoid having to go across the Pacific Ocean. But now there's a temptation that there's a temptation to have Chinese companies and American multinationals moving back to Mexico because energy is so damn expensive in China. And to the extent that Mexico can really reduce its energy prices, that leads some energy-intensive companies to find it attractive beyond what they were experiencing before. Inbound, when you have, for example, a trucker crossing the border from Mexico in the United States and then going to Canada and not having to stop, that's called inbound. And what that means is you don't pay customs duties for it, because all it's doing is transiting a country. And to the extent that trade corridors develop in that way, this is going to be a really, really good way of avoiding the border delays. I think I probably said too much already.
Thank you very much. They're all very relevant questions, and I will try to comment on all of them at least a little bit. I'll start with the one in security. If I understood correctly, the question is how do we convince certain political actors in the United States that it's worth, more cooperation or more, border infrastructure in Mexico is convenient from a security point of view. The answer is relatively simple. A security strategy is about assigning risks or identifying risk, assigning them probabilities of occurrence, and then using whatever resources you have available to reduce those probabilities. And no security strategy anywhere in the world is perfect. I think that over the course of the past 10 years, the three countries have been beginning to do that to some extent. No, there's a lot of security cooperation going on in North America nowadays. But specifically at the border, the strategy is separating the risky flows from the unrisky flows, and making that the global system. There's a card. I don't have it with me right now, but there's a card in which people can now go through either a Centro lane very quickly in an airport because you have been vetted or you have been pre-checked or pre-cleared. And that allows that security resources on both sides, rather than concentrating and having tons of, this might be politically incorrect, but having tons of border agents and policemen and security all throughout the border. You accelerate the flows that you know that are legitimate and secure. And you concentrate those efforts on the ones that are, there's for whatever reason, you feel uneasy about. And so it's actually having a modern border in terms of facilitating trade flows. It's consistent with a better security strategy from my point of view. And I think that the Homeland Security Department has begun to realize that. And it's beginning to move with a lot of programs, as well as Mexico and both in Canada, to try again to expedite legitimate flows, make cars, trucks, people that are legitimate and are traveling for legitimate reasons and post those security go as fast as possible, and then try to devote their resources to risky flows. So they're not inconsistent. If somebody is really trying to understand, it's possible, and it can be proven. So I think that I think that's the central core of the argument to convince people that it makes sense to do that. On the shale gas, energy infrastructure is extremely lumpy. It's not as if everybody's very eager about what's going to happen in Mexico with the reform. And I am too. I think it's a game changer for Mexico. It's as important as NAFTA was 20 years ago. But it's not going to occur from one day to another, not even the shale gas. Mexico has shale, yes, a lot of it. Is it the same as the Eagle Ford shale goes and continues down south? But it's not as if, not even in 3 years you're going to push a button and get all the infrastructure. Texas has been investing on that infrastructure for years, and not only on the extraction, but precisely on the distribution and lines that are needed. And Mexico doesn't have that. So what is probably going to happen, in my view, is that Mexico will continue. It will import more gas from the United States once these pipelines are there. It will tend to balance out, and investments on the shale, on gas on the border where we have it, will start and will eventually, they're going to be ready, 5 years from now. So it's not a very quick adjustment, I think. It'll take much more time. Now, on the environmental part of the shale gas, the central concern, which is a valid one, is the amounts of water that are needed and the chemicals that are put in the water as you do the fracking. There's a lot of debate about that. I think that it's perhaps natural. It's a relatively new technology. Mexico could probably have the advantage of being not the first player there, but knowing about what has happened already and how to address, if not all, some of the environmental concerns that are in fact part of the shale gas exploration. Now, we're an environmental bank. We're a green bank. We believe in the environment. We have a mandate to clean it. But at the same time, for example, gas is 0.5% cleaner than other fossil fuels. So we have a discussions among ourselves whether it's worthwhile pursuing investments from an environmental point of view in natural gas, and that's a debate that is there. What we know is that it is at least half as clean as the fossil fuels that we're using, coal and petrol on Mexico and also here in the United States. So is it worth it? Is it an environmental investment? I think that's a debate that is very much out there. My view is that it is, but there are certainly people that would not see the natural gas infrastructure as part of an environmental investment. Steve Niemeyer, on the 300-kilometer, yes, the bank operates 100 kilometer north. There have been discussions about extending it and make it, I have no problem with that. I'll be straightforward. I think that the border caucus in the U.S. and will have to, have assurances that we will continue to be very much focused on the close proximity, because the border does have the very close border does have a lot of needs in environmental infrastructure. But again, these changes are slow. They don't occur from one day to another. So if there's a discussion and there's a change and a legislative change, both in Mexico and the U.S. to make it 300, well, we will just have more jobs, so more work, but that's fine. And finally, Alejandro, on the levels of government, there's a picture that I love that is in San Luis Rio Colorado and Sonora. It's a picture that there's a fire in Mexico in a house that is right next to the border, and there's a fire truck on the U.S. side that just went parked on the way back, put a ladder, the hose, and it's pumping water into Mexico, putting down the fire. No? I think that explains it. So, and at the same time, I'm going to be improper perhaps, but you have, in a very close date, you had the two very relevant government officials signing a joint memorandum of understanding for emergency preparedness. No, I mean, the local communities and local governments, and I'm talking extremely about the border, will always find a way to coexist in spite of the federal governments, no, and to work as best as possible. Should the concerns of local government, I think there's a lot of experience that is rich in terms of how these binational cities and these border communities have solved problems, and I think it should very much be taken into account by the federal government, and I think to a large extent they do, no. But those would be my comments.
I just want to say so, because to me this is just funny. Someone asked about the drug trade. The shale gas in the Eagle Ford stretches through, I think, 25 Texas counties, but near the Mexican border. To be able to drill, the drilling companies have actually had to create their own roads in these backwoods here, because they have to supply these drilling rigs. It's been reported anecdotally that the drug traffickers love that, because you don't have DPS patrolling those roads, you don't have anybody patrolling those roads, and they're new, so it gives them, and they don't have to pay for using it. So the oil drillers and natural gas drillers have been giving us anecdotal evidence that that's one unintended consequence of the shale boom.
Okay, can we take another round? We have a few more minutes. Other questions from the audience? Alejandro, do you want to say anything else about energy, or just wait to the next panel? Because some of what we're talking about, do you want to, is it now or do you want to wait? Up to you.
Well, I might wait, because I want to show you a couple of slides.
All right.
On what it entails.
Other questions or comments? Okay, well, why don't we see if anybody on our panel has any final thoughts or comments. Dave, is there anything else you want to say come to your mind?
Well, I thought I really was impressed with the thoughtful ideas each of my colleagues had, and I learned a lot, and I appreciate each of your talks. Thank you.
Judith, anything else? Leigh? Geronimo?
Just a very final comment that somebody made yesterday that I think it's worth it. These panels, we are always talking essentially to the same group of people. Mm-hmm. And it's being televised, and I'm glad that that's the case, because you find out that there are people looking at these discussions other ways. But these panels, even though we should strive as to have these panels, and they should be taking place in Kansas City and in Zacatecas, or because we're in places, as President Cedillo said yesterday, where we're not preaching to the choir. I think that will be very useful, because there's great knowledge on them and a lot of experience. But I think to the extent that we continue to do that, for those of us who believe in more integration and the success that NAFTA has been, I think it's worth it to do it.
Okay, well, please join me in giving a round of applause to our panel.